You've heard the story, I'm sure, about the man on the rooftop of his house in the flood drifting down, and a raft comes along and they say, jump on. No, he doesn't want to jump on. A boat comes along and he just figures he's too far up on the roof to jump off, and he won't do it. And then a helicopter comes overhead and lets down a rope. Well, he's afraid of height. Of course, he eventually gets to heaven. Wrapping out his long litany of faithful acts that he's committed, he asks God why he didn't save him. And throughout the quote from Ephesians, it said, by grace are you saved through faith. You know what the answer was. Who do you think sent you the boat, the raft, and the helicopter? Well, you and I have these subconscious expectations that events that happen in specific ways should happen. We know our thoughts create our lives, but we also have these conditions. If you're like me, it's so easy to get hung up on them. We don't notice the small shifts in our consciousness that are taking place all the time. I know that some folks advocate specificity in our conversations with God, or whatever you choose to call a Christ within. But that's a whole different story and worthwhile considering. But I'm not going there today. Today my talk is about the solving grace of prayer. We will unpack from my perspective, the three elements of its title: prayer, grace, and the solution. Kat gave me a perfect segue last week when she used this quote: the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. We've been talking about prayer all month. Generally, we could say that prayer is a conversation with God. We know that conversation is a two-way street, that it involves listening. So we go into the silence to better hear the still small voice. We also know that our thoughts are prayers and that we are praying all the time, not only in our appointed hour, but all day. When we encounter the person who is toxic to us, or the situation that runs up our backbone the wrong way, and we judge, condemn, and complain in our hearts. Our gut reacts in anger and impatience rather than blessing, and we think, what's the matter with me? I'm coming from the same low self I detest in others. Score one knockdown for the Christ within. In the physical world, where we can see, touch, hear, and taste, the reality of resonance describes how different energies in alignment with one another influence one another. For example, pluck one string on a guitar and a second guitar tuned to the same frequency will pick it up. But here's what's amazing. Stop the vibration in the first guitar and the second guitar will transfer its vibrations so that the first guitar starts vibrating again. Have you ever had any experience like that? Music hath charms to soothe the savage beast, the poet said. Unfortunately, it's also true that music has the ability to churn up the beast as well. Have you noticed any change in your musical taste since you've been following the path? Bruce Lipton, you all know who he is, talks about how scientists can measure that same resonance in the human brain by means of an electromagnetic probe. It doesn't even touch the head. Unlike the electroencephalogram that has its terminals on the brain. This doesn't even touch the head. Even more amazing, it measures the energy we send out to a distance that is only limited by the sensitivity of the instrument. They can't tell you how far this energy field extends. If our thoughts are prayers, as we sing, where do these prayers go? Through quantum physics, we know that we all are essence, in our essence, are energy. That everything is energy. As physical beings, we humans like to handle things with our physical senses. Now, with the evidence of physical science at hand, can I be more conscious of the vibrations I send out? Unfortunately, consciousness doesn't mean control. And this is where I intended to bring in a blurb about the Power Up class. Because those of us who are joining it will discover how using our 12 innate faculties according to our efforts will develop the audacity to use them according to our highest self. So, what about grace? Another intangible that we can feel, but not see. 40 years ago, when the Jesus revival pulled out the rug from under the staid mainline churches in my Anglican communion, it pulled me into fellowship with the charismatic Christians, people who were supposed to be like-minded, but some of whom I could not agree with. I knew the law, or thought I did. And in thought, word, or deed, I had broken every one of the 10 commandments. At 30, according to some pronouncements, I was doomed to hell. John 1:17 says, quote, "The law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ," unquote. Was there something beyond the law? I wondered. The author of Ephesians says, "By grace you are saved through faith." I wanted to be saved. I didn't want to go to hell. And I didn't want to live my life as though I might. I had to find out what this grace is that the Bible talks about and that our faith supposedly secures. So I did an independent study on what the Bible had to say about it. That was as independent as I could make it, giving all the hellfire and brimstone that was flying around at that time. According to Wikipedia, grace is a theological term present in all major religions and is defined as the divine influence that operates in humans to rejuvenate, sanctify, and inspire virtuous impulses, and to implant strength to endure trial and resist temptation. A mediator in conflict finds one small facet upon which opponents can agree, and rather than remaining in a stalemate, progress is made by enlarging the vision of all that is involved, of all people involved. But there has to be a willingness to solve the problem. Grace is not a word we hear very much about. We hardly even think about it as we wait to be saved from our situation. With a concordance, I searched the word grace in my still beloved King James Version, verifying my intuitive understanding in more modern texts, and in deep conversation with my dear friend who is now in the spirit world, whom I call my spiritual mother. It turned out to be a wonderful exploration, exciting, comforting, and one that changed my life as it changed my name. As it turns out, I discovered that grace meant grace. That was my middle name. So, overnight, I became not just Carol, but CarylAnn, joy and grace. My mentor and the former Dean of Education, Dr. Paul Hasselbeck, in heart-centered metaphysics throws a real curve. He says, grace is the name given to the aspect of divine law that does not deal in even exchanges. Whoa. If we don't get back exactly what we send out, then something must happen between the sending and the receiving. A little further along, in the same essay, Hasselbeck says, grace deals with the increase of good through greater giving. I have a question. Who does the giving? If grace is the personal action that does not deal in even exchanges, grace is what reconciles seeming differences, expanding our idea of oneness. Remember, oneness is not sameness. On one hand, it appears that grace and the law have to be two separate things. Moses brought the first, Jesus brought the latter. If we saw grace happening, would it be throwing a monkey wrench in the law? So over the years, the paradox of grace and truth haunted at me, worried at my conscience. Then I discovered a physical reality that seemed to me, at least, to verify the oneness that, like so many differences we pick at, are actually two aspects of the same thing. The one expanding the other so that they resonate together like two guitar strings. But it's only by picking at seeming differences, paradoxes, two truths that appear to be the same, that say the same thing. And eventually they will merge in our understanding. The physical demonstration of the metaphysics of paradox and the verification of Hasselbeck's scholarship came in a museum somewhere back east. Bob and I stood in the bay of a gigantic museum somewhere back east, unlike watching the swinging pendulum that could sustain itself indefinitely. But unlike the back and forth of the arc we expected, the exhibit informed us that in approximately 24 hours, the pendulum would make a complete circle around the floor of the pit, which was marked off, over which it hung, and was marked off in degrees. Without the measurements beneath it, the small shifts in the trajectory of the pendulum could not be detected. Furthermore, fascinated, we stood there long enough to see a significant change in the arc as it registered the trajectory on the floor below. Grace is like that. By grace we are changed through faith, the gospel writer wrote. Eventually we see it in ourselves when the change is great enough. One of the benefits of being in a long-term relationship is that others see it before we do, and that encourages us to keep going. Charles Fillmore says, grace is the unconditional love of divine mind that we are and is always available. Regardless of how negatively we may view ourselves, how unworthy, grace is always present. Through grace, we become worthy. We become able to realize our worthiness by the very fact that we are the image of God. And within divine love, we can always change our minds, because divine ideas are the limitless possibilities always open to us. Change your mind. Change your life. That's the law. So we've talked a bit about prayer. We've talked a bit about grace. What's the solution? What is always the solution? Surrender to what is. Where am I? Fillmore says, the solving grace of prayer is our own willingness to study, pray, meditate, and surrender to the grace and truth of unconditional love. Grace is the personal action that does not deal in even exchanges. Therefore, grace is able to reconcile seeming differences, expanding our idea of oneness. Fillmore, in the Revealing Word, says, grace is the real, saving, redeeming, transforming power that came to man through the work of Jesus in establishing for the race a new and higher consciousness. Truth comes out of that willingness. Grace is the solving power within prayer. Surrender to what is the solution. And I thank you all.